Recently, critical race theory, also known as CRT, has been coming under attack for being taught in school. In fact, it's already been banned in Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, with 16 other states pushing it through their legislation as of this moment. And the reason for this, as far as I can tell, is because our actual factual history makes white people look bad. Personally, I think banning CRT all over the country is making white people look bad, but that's just me. As my own personal protest against the unbelievable narcissism and stupidity of half of the country, I'm going to explain all the horrible and racist things that's been going on in this country since before its inception, or at least as many things as I'm willing to explain in a single video. First, I thought I'd talk about my own opinion about race, which is based on scientific fact, but it's still just my opinion. When examining our DNA, every human being is 99.9% identical to one another. That's because we're all part of one race, known as the human race, and really anything you do to someone else, you're essentially doing to yourself. You also can't determine someone's race on a DNA test because race is a made-up social construct which, unfortunately, just like every other made-up social construct, we all just have to put up with. Okay. In 1492, some jerk named Christopher Columbus discovered America. Except not really, because the first people actually came to the American continents right around 10,000 BCE or so. Also, Vikings had a settlement in Canada since about 1000 CE. But Columbus somehow stole all the credit, even though he himself died still thinking he had reached Asia, and not a new continent. What he did while he was in America was kill, rape, and enslave the indigenous people as he saw fit. Eventually, people left England to form colonies in America. They found that not only was it a very long trip that was hard to survive, that once they got here, they were just as likely to starve to death as they were to get murdered by Native Americans or other things in the harsh wilderness. So, in the end, there weren't enough workers to do all the work needed to establish English colonies in the New World. So the colonists turned to slavery to get the job done. They tried capturing Native Americans first, but they were just as likely to escape into a wilderness they were much more familiar with than early colonists, as they were to die suddenly from some crazy European disease. So that turned out to be unreliable at best. Fast forward to 1619, and the first slave ship straight from Africa comes to the American colonies, and the Atlantic slave trade begins. And slavery was allowed in all 13 colonies, though Georgia was created as a free state in 1735. They then changed their mind 15 years later. Let's talk about American slavery. Though there's been slaves in every country at one point or another, and there's even countries where slavery is still legal, including India, but America is special in that its slave trade was inherently racist from the beginning, because it consisted almost entirely of black people from Africa. So even before the formation of the United States, the white people from Europe saw the enslaved black people from Africa as second-class citizens. But it became some sort of twisted form of American pride, because even the poorest white person could feel like they were superior to slaves. Anyway, let's continue on with our horrible history and point out that business was booming for the Atlantic slave trade, and over 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and shipped to the New World during this time. There wasn't even laws concerning slave rights in America until 1640, and that was only to further increase the difference between black slavery and white indentured servitude. Basically, whites had a contract. Blacks were enslaved for life. Racist stereotypes were pervasive from the beginning, and the not really that funny thing about it is that most of the stereotypes are the same ones we still have today. Benjamin Franklin, normally a very intelligent and forward-thinking person, thought that black people were unable to learn anything until a friend of his showed him an all-black elementary school while class was in session. But that's how pervasive and systemic this misinformation was at the time. It was done to rationalize further systemic racism and dehumanization all across colonial America. I'm just going to quickly point out that the first police in this country were originally called Slave Patrol, and their sole purpose was to capture runaway slaves and stop slave uprisings before they started. Okay, skipping ahead to just after the Revolutionary War, America's founding fathers were forging a constitution. Many of them wanted to get rid of slavery, but also many of them wanted to keep it to increase American expansion. And most of them were slave owners themselves, but it was banned in the northern states. Though this was a slow process and the laws had a lot of loopholes, and some so-called free states had slaves until 1840. But they kept slavery in the southern states and didn't even put anything about slavery in the final draft of the Constitution. Oh, but they did make the 3/5 compromise, which meant that they would only count slaves as 3/5 of a person on the census. but only so that the southern states weren't given too much power in Congress or in presidential election for having so many extra enslaved people. Then, a few years later, the U.S. government enacted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which effectively meant that escaped slaves found in free states would have to be returned to their owners. Laws were made to counter this by abolitionists in northern states so that the slave hunters needed definitive proof of ownership in order to take them back. But this is the main reason the Underground Railroad extended all the way to Canada, where slavery had been abolished. I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but know that the enslaved black population in the South were tortured by their owners. The goal was to break them down psychologically until they did nothing but follow orders. And the slaves who showed any amount of intelligence or individuality were tortured even harder than the others. Systemic laws were put into place to make it so it was legal for slaves to learn to read, or that their children were the immediate property of their owners. And other equally horrible and dehumanizing laws just like that were put in place during this time period. Jumping ahead to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln makes the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that all slaves in the Confederate States were free, while all the slaves in the Union slave-owning states were still slaves. It effectively didn't free anybody, because the Union slaves were still slaves, and the Confederate States just seceded from the Union and weren't about to listen to anything the Union's president had to say about anything. No. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution in December of 1865 that all slaves in the recently reunited states were officially freed. But in comes Jim Crow laws that were further solidified by the Supreme Court as separate but equal, that separated black and white communities, bathrooms, drinking fountains, and so on, so it was impossible to integrate. And the equal part of separate but equal was a total lie, as this was only meant to keep African Americans down with lower quality, well, everything. Okay, it wasn't just these crazy and stupid laws either, but the white racist people in control of the media at the time was creating an image of African American people with the purpose of making sure they never got any power in this country at all. The American media at the time painted a picture of the black person as if he or she were completely out of control, that they would become totally psychotic if left to their own devices. This was a campaign of racist scapegoating meant only to further suppress and bully what was already the most subjugated group of people in America at that point in time. Let's jump to 1915. The world has slowly turned to film as the newest form of entertainment. Though what they called movies then, we would probably refer to as short films or even microfilms, considering how short some of them are. But in comes D.W. Griffith with the first American-made feature-length film, The Birth of a Nation, which is unfortunately a permanent stain on film history because it's a very beautifully shot piece of racist propaganda. The messages of the film seem to be that, aside from spraying the same racial stereotypes racists of this country have always spread about black people, it's to spread the message that all African Americans are thieves and evil people who are only looking to rape white women and are only trying to steal the U.S. away from the good whites of this country. It also basically says that all people of mixed races are doomed to be psychopaths because the genetics are so different. Oh, and it also makes up this fabricated event where black people were blocking whites from voting in order to steal an election. Also, it paints the Ku Klux Klan as the good guys here to save us from the horrible psychopathic black people. This movie basically takes your reality and substitutes its own. The problem with this film, outside of its content, was that it was highly publicized and widely released all across the country. Pretty much everyone watched it. Not only was it the first feature-length film, it was also the first blockbuster. And at the time of the film's release, the KKK had stopped existing. But after this film was opened all around the country, the KKK suddenly came back in full force. But this is how bad the misinformation against black people was at the time, because many people watched this film and totally believed what they saw on screen. I mean, things weren't great for African Americans at the time, but this movie single-handedly set race relations in this country back at least 10 years. Sorry, maybe that isn't as important as I think it is, but I just really hate that movie and everything it represents. Anyway, despite amazing advancements in technology and communication during this time period, legally enforced segregation continued in the United States until 1964, and minorities and women weren't even assured the right to vote in every state until the following year, which was also the year that Malcolm X was killed, And in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was also murdered, showing that race relationships in this country were still just as divided as they'd ever been. And if I've learned nothing else researching this stuff, as soon as African Americans achieve anything in this country, things have to get worse for them in other ways. In this case, through the use of other government systems. From 1981 to 1997, black farmers were refused loans that white farmers received in similar circumstances. The war on drugs started in 1982 made it so that people caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, more typically sold to lower-class African Americans, would mean a mandatory 5-year prison sentence, while you would need 500 grams of powder cocaine, more typically used by upper-class white people, to get the same sentence. And during the 1980s and 90s, racial tensions were so high that riots started happening all over the country, always because of tension between minority communities and the police. The most famous being the LA riots that happened in 1992, and there are over 100 recorded instances of mass racial violence since 1935, almost all of which was started by a police incident. And this more or less brings us to today. Violence from the police is still very common to blacks and other minority Americans. In fact, you are 5 times more likely to wind up in jail if you are a non-white race in this country. Racial tensions seem to be as bad as they've always been, and now we're banning teaching critical race theory in school because the United States of America isn't the perfect little bubble of freedom and fairness certain people want to pretend it is. I guess all I can really leave you with now is the old adage that those that forget their history are doomed to repeat it.